The sea breathed in restless waves, sighing against the jagged cliffs of Velora's reach. Moonlight spilled like silver silk upon the water, dancing over a kingdom unseen by mortal eyes. Beneath the tide, beyond the reach of men, the realm of the merfolk shimmered, a world of opal towers, coral spires, and a throne carved from the bones of the deep. Within the royal halls of Thalvian Tyborn, the Sea King's voice echoed like rolling thunder. His daughter, Seraphine, stood before him, her pearl-white hair flowing like cascading foam, her eyes the blue of a tempest-kissed horizon. Her beauty was a melody woven into the sea itself, yet no man had ever laid eyes upon her true form. It was forbidden. "No one shall claim your hand without seeing your face," the king decreed, "and no man shall see it and live, unless he is worthy of the ocean's embrace." The words were law, carved into the heart of the sea. Many had come, kings and warriors, men with crowns of gold and hearts of iron, but none had endured. They drowned, they wept, they perished in madness. The sea chose only the strongest, the purest, and in all her years, Seraphine had found none. But far beyond the waves, a man did not fear legends. Kael Draven, captain of the storm-moored ship the Daggerwake, sailed the cursed waters, chasing the dream that men whispered only in shadow taverns. He was no king, no knight draped in honor. He was a pirate, carved from salt and steel, his body marked by battles fought against the tide. His hair was dark as the starless sky, his eyes a cold, merciless green, yet in their depths there burned a fire that even the ocean could not quench. And he had made a vow. He did not seek the mermaid princess for her face, nor for the riches her hand would bring. No, Kael sought the legend herself. He wished to love a woman whose soul could command the sea, whose voice could summon storms. He would claim her heart without ever laying eyes upon it. "Foolish," said the old seer Maros the Brine-eyed, as Kael stood before him in the camel-lit chamber of a forgotten isle. The air smelled of brine and prophecy. "You cannot love what you do not see." Kael only smiled, the kind of smile that made even fate itself pause. "Then let me be the first." And so he set sail. The wind howled, the sky darkened, and the ocean raged against him. Vedalora did not welcome intruders. Its waters churned with the fury of forgotten gods, its guardians, the monstrous Leviathan lords, stirred in their deep slumber. But Kael did not falter. He stood at the helm, hands steady upon the wheel, the storm screaming against his skin. And then the sea answered. A wave taller than the mast rose from the abyss, swallowing the ship whole. Kael was thrown into darkness, the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of the ocean crushing the air from his lungs. But just as the abyss reached for him, something else did too. Soft hands, a voice like a song half heard beneath the waves, a whisper against his sinking mind, a warmth that should not exist in the cold. And then light. Kael gasped awake, but he did not see the face of the one who saved him, only the flicker of a form moving through the water, a glimmer of silver and white vanishing into the depths. A voice, distant yet near. "Do not search for me, pirate. You do not belong to the sea." Kael, still breathless from death's grasp, only smiled once more. "Then let the sea take me, for I do not belong to the land either." And far below, hidden behind coral veils in shifting shadows, Seraphine Tyborn's heart stirred for the first time. The tide stirred in restless murmurs, whispering secrets only the sea could understand. Darkness still clung to the horizon as Kael Draven awoke, breath shallow, limbs heavy as though the ocean had claimed parts of him and refused to give them back. The cavern walls around him pulsed with a soft, eerie glow, the light trapped within veins of pearl and crystal. He was alive, but he was not alone. Somewhere in the shadows, a presence lingered. A voice, delicate as mist yet woven with the weight of ancient tides, drifted through the air. "You should not be here." Kael's fingers curled against damp stone. His body ached from the sea's punishment, but his will had not broken. Slowly, he pushed himself upright. And yet, here I am. Silence stretched between them, an invisible current shifting in the air. He could not see her, not fully. She remained beyond the shimmering veil of water that cascaded from the cavern ceiling, her form a ripple in the dim glow. But even hidden, her presence was unmistakable. Seraphine. The name clung to his mind like a psalm unfinished, a whisper the ocean had carried to him long before this night. He had chased the legend, but now the legend was watching him. You saved me. His voice was hoarse, rough like the tide-worn edges of a broken ship. I did. Why? A pause, delicate yet charged, because the sea does not choose who it keeps. Kale let out a breath, a smirk teasing his lips. But you do. He swore he felt the air shift, the weight of unspoken truths pressing between them. A prince, a noble, a warrior, all had begged for a glimpse of her face. He had asked for nothing, and yet she had reached for him. The water stirred as she moved, unseen beyond the veil. You should not have come. Kale tilted his head, studying the shimmer where she lingered. And yet I came. Seraphine's fingers brushed against the water's surface. A ripple danced outward, touching the edge of light. He could not see her, but she saw him. A man shaped by storms, his body marked with battles fought against the sea. A pirate, they called him. A thief, a rogue, a creature of the land who should have drowned like the rest. But he had not. He had survived. And he did not fear her. Seraphine's voice softened, though the command in it did not waver. You must leave before my father knows you are here. Kale let out a low chuckle, leaning back against the cool stone. And if I don't? She did not answer. Because she did not know. Because for the first time in her immortal life, she had broken the rules. The ocean did not love. The ocean did not care. But Seraphine, she had reached for a drowning man instead of letting the tide decide his fate. Beyond the cavern, the sea raged. King Thalvian would know soon enough. The waves would speak, and the Leviathan lords would come. No mortal man could trespass upon sacred waters and live. And yet, Kale did not beg. He did not swear false oaths of devotion or weave golden words like the others had. He simply sat in the glow of the cavern, his gaze never searching for what she did not offer. Then I suppose I'll have to stay hidden, he said, his voice a quiet storm, dangerous and unyielding. Seraphine should have feared him. She should have turned away. Instead, she whispered, then be silent, pirate. Let the sea forget you exist. But neither of them knew. The sea forgets nothing. The cavern breathed with the tide, the water rising and falling in a slow, ancient rhythm. Soft light shimmered against the walls, casting silver reflections over Kale Draven's weathered skin. The salt still clung to him, his clothes damp, his dark hair curling against his forehead. But his eyes, sharp, unyielding, remained fixed on the veil of cascading water before him. Somewhere beyond it, she was there. Seraphine Tideborn. She had remained unseen, a shadow in the glow, a presence just out of reach. But Kale felt her, the way the air thickened when she moved, the way the water carried the sound of her breath. She was the tide itself, fluid, untouchable, yet powerful enough to pull them under. Neither spoke for a long while. Then at last, her voice broke the silence, soft as a wave slipping over the shore. You are still here. Kale tilted his head, a smirk coasting over his lips. And you have not thrown me back into the sea. A pause. Not yet. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. He shifted, stretching out his legs as though he had made a home in the heart of danger itself. Then I must have done something right. Beyond the veil, Seraphine's fingers trailed over the water, watching how it shaped itself around her hand. She should not have saved him. She should not have let him linger in this sacred place. Yet something about this man unsettled her, not in fear, but in something deeper, something unspoken. You are reckless, she murmured. Kale leaned back against the cavern wall, arms folding over his chest. Some would say brave. Bravery and recklessness are not the same. Depends on the story. A ripple passed through the water between them. The way he spoke, as if the sea itself could not command him, as if legends were written in the choices of men, not the will of the ocean. It was dangerous. And yet, what do you want, pirate? Kale exhaled slowly, his gaze never straying toward the veil. I told you before, I came to find you. Seraphine's heart tightened, though she did not understand why. You seek what you cannot have, she said. A flicker of something deeper passed through his expression, but it was gone before she could name it. And what if I only seek what you already gave? She stilled. What have I given you? Kale's voice dropped lower, quieter, like the hush before a storm. Your voice. The words lingered, wrapping around her like the tide. No man had ever said such a thing. They spoke of her beauty, her face unseen, the mystery of her form. But this one, he had nothing but her voice, her words, and still he stayed. I could take it back, she whispered. Kale smirked. Then I would have nothing, and yet I would still remain. A silence stretched between them, thick with something that neither could name. The ocean whispered, the cavern hummed, and for the first time in her immortal life, Seraphine did not feel like a creature of legend, but simply a woman unseen. Beyond the safety of the cove, the sea churned. The currents carried news faster than words. The Leviathan lords were stirring. The ocean had felt the weight of something shifting, something forbidden. And soon it would come to claim what was never meant to be. The cavern pulsed with the rhythm of the tide, water shifting in quiet murmurs against the stone. A lantern of bioluminescent coral cast a soft glow, turning the shadows into fluid shapes. Seraphine lingered beyond the veil of cascading water, unseen but ever present, her voice the only bridge between them. Kale Draven had not moved from his place against the cavern wall. His breathing was steady, his sharp eyes half-lidded, watching the way the light twisted across the water's surface. He could feel her there, just beyond reach, a force both untouchable and near enough to drown in. You should have let me die, he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a truth too heavy to name. Seraphine's breath caught, though she did not know why. The sea would have swallowed you whole, she murmured. You would have been forgotten like all the others. Kale exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his dark, still damp hair. And yet I am here. A silence stretched between them, thick with something neither dared speak aloud. The pirate and the princess, one bound to the tides, the other to the stars. They should have been nothing to one another. And yet, Kale's fingers brushed against the stone floor, tracing patterns without thought. Tell me, Seraphine, have you ever wished to see the world beyond the sea? She did not answer at once. She had never been asked such a thing. The ocean had always been her world, her kingdom, her prison. She had never imagined more because more was never meant for her. I do not belong to the land, she said at last. Kale smirked, tilting his head. Neither do I, and yet I walk upon it. A ripple passed through the water. Something in her chest tightened. Before she could speak, the sea itself shifted, the currents outside the cavern turning cold, unnatural. A deep, ancient rumble rolled through the depths, a warning carried through the blackened waters. Seraphine stiffened. They are coming, she whispered. Kale frowned, pushing himself upright. Who? She hesitated, then murmured, the Leviathan lords. Kale had heard the name before, whispered in fear by sailors who never returned to shore. Beasts of the deep, guardians of the old laws. They hunted those who trespassed where no mortal should tread. And now they hunted him. The cavern seemed to close in around them, the water growing colder. Seraphine turned, her form shifting just beyond the light. You must go. Kale took a step toward the veil, his voice calm despite the storm rising beyond. And if I don't? She hesitated. Then for the first time she pushed forward, not enough for the veil to break, but enough that the glow of the water caught the barest glimpse of her hand. Kale stilled. Slender fingers, delicate yet powerful, hovered just beyond reach, the color of moonlight on the waves. If you stay, they will tear you apart, she whispered. Not even the sea will remember you. Kale's gaze lowered, taking in the flicker of her presence. She had saved him once, and now she feared for him. His fingers twitched at his side. To reach for her would be a mistake, but gods did he want to. Instead, he exhaled, a slow smirk tugging at his lips. Then perhaps I should give them a reason to remember me. Seraphine's breath hitched. Kale. But before she could stop him, he turned toward the sea, toward the oncoming storm, stepping into the darkness that waited beyond. And far beneath them, the ocean began to wake. The sea was restless. Dark waves coiled like hungry serpents, surging against the cavern's entrance. The water no longer sang in gentle murmurs. It roared, its voice thick with warning. Something ancient had awakened. Kale Draven stood at the edge of the tide, his boots half submerged in the cold, foaming brine. The air was thick with salt, electric with the presence of unseen forces. He did not flinch. Fear had never ruled him, only the promise of the unknown. Behind him, Seraphine lingered at the veil of falling water, torn between what she was and what she had done. She had saved him, and now the sea had come to take him back. A low tremor rolled through the depths, the kind that sent ripples up a mortal spine. The Leviathan lords were near. "You do not understand what is coming," Seraphine whispered, her voice woven with the pull of the tide. "You cannot fight them." Kale did not turn to face her. Instead, he studied the horizon beyond the cavern's mouth, where the water had darkened into an abyss. "I've spent my life fighting things I shouldn't," he said. A smirk ghosted his lips. "And yet, here I stand." A surge of water slammed against the rocks, sending cold spray against his skin. It was a warning, a demand. Seraphine's breath trembled. She stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch the curve of her shoulder, the bearish shimmer of iridescent scales. No man had ever seen her. And yet she feared she would let this one. "You do not belong here," she murmured. Kale's fingers curled at his sides, but his voice was softer now. "And yet I am here." Something passed between them then, a pull stronger than the tide, more certain than the shifting moon. Seraphine swallowed hard. "If they find you, there will be no mercy." Kale exhaled slowly, tilting his head. "Then I suppose I'll need a reason to survive." For a moment, silence. Then, before she could think, before she could stop herself, Seraphine moved. The veil of water shimmered, and for the briefest of moments, Kale saw her. She was moonlight upon the waves, the ghost of a siren's song, the untouchable dream of sailors lost to the sea. Her hair, dark as the deepest trench, curled in silken waves over bare shoulders. Her eyes, stormlit silver, held depths even the ocean feared. And her skin, kissed with the shimmer of ancient tides, glowed beneath the cavern's light. Kale did not breathe. He did not speak, because to name something so unearthly was to risk losing it. Seraphine held his gaze, her heart pounding like the drums of the deep. This was a mistake. And yet, Kale reached out, not enough to touch, but enough for the space between them to feel like something fragile, something unfinished. "Now I understand," he murmured. Seraphine's lips parted, a question forming, but before it could slip free, the sea erupted. The cavern shuddered. Water surged inward, wrapping around Kale's legs like grasping hands. A roar, deep and terrible, shook the ocean itself. The Leviathan lords had come. Seraphine gasped, her form vanishing behind the veil once more. "Kale, run!" But the pirate only smiled, his hand tightening around the hilt of his cutlass. "Not tonight, love." And as the storm raged, the sea bore witness to a battle it had never seen before. The ocean roared like a wounded beast, waves thrashing against the cavern walls. Water twisted and coiled around Kale Draven's legs, not as an embrace, but a warning. A force older than time itself had stirred, and the depths trembled in its wake. Then they emerged, the Leviathan lords. From the blackened waters, monstrous forms rose, half shadow, half flesh, their bodies shifting like the tide. Their eyes, cold and abyssal, locked onto Kale, reading him as one would rid the dying embers of a fire before it was drowned. Intruder. Their voices did not break the air, yet Kale felt them like the weight of the deep. Seraphine watched from the veil, her fingers gripping the cavern wall. She had seen men fight storms, fight beasts, even fight the wrath of the sea itself. But never had she seen a man stand before the Leviathan lords and not tremble. "Turn back," one of them rumbled, its voice a tide pulling at his soul. Kale only smirked, adjusting his grip on his cutlass. Afraid of a single man? The sea convulsed in response, rising high, a wall of black water preparing to crash down. Seraphine's breath hitched. This was madness. She could not watch him be swallowed whole. Without thinking, she moved. The ocean parted for her as she stepped forward into the light, into the eyes of the creatures who had once called her their own. "Stop," she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of the tide. "He is under my protection." The Leviathan lords hesitated, their hulking forms shifting. A mermaid princess, defying the sea's decree. Kale's head turned sharply, catching the way Seraphine's form shimmered, no longer hidden behind the veil. His heart twisted, not in fear, but in something deeper, something impossible. You would claim a land walker, one of the lords hissed, its shape shifting, turning darker. Seraphine did not waver. I already have. The words left her lips before she could stop them. The moment they touched the air, the sea itself seemed to freeze. Kale's smirk faded, something unreadable flickering in his storm-dark eyes. A claim. A bond. He had spent his life fighting for survival, taking what he wished, never bound by anything but the call of adventure. And yet, here she stood, binding him not in chains, but in something stronger. The Leviathan lords seethed, their presence rippling through the water. The ocean does not forget betrayal. Seraphine lifted her chin, defiant. Then let it remember this. Before reason could stop her, she turned and pressed her palm against Kale's chest. A shudder passed through them both, something unseen, something ancient. The sea gasped. Kale barely had time to react before a pulse of energy surged through his veins. A warmth unlike anything he had known, like the sun rising over a horizon he had never seen. Seraphine's silver eyes searched his. Now she whispered, her voice laced with something raw, something she could not name. Run. And Kale Draven, for the first time in his life, did as he was told. Kale Draven ran. The ocean howled behind him, a storm of fury rising in his wake. The cavern walls shuddered as waves crashed, desperate to pull him back. He leaped onto the jagged rocks, his boots slipping against the wet stone, but his grip was steady, his body driven by something far stronger than fear. The Leviathan lords roared, their voices shaking the very bones of the earth. The sea did not let its prisoners go so easily. And yet, Seraphine had made her choice. She had chosen him. She had spoken his name not as a warning, not as a curse, but as something else, something forbidden. Kale reached the cavern's mouth, where the dark water met the open sea. His ship, the Eclipse, bobbed in the distance, its sails torn, its crew shouting in panic. The storm churned, hungry, ready to claim its prize. But Kale was not ready to be claimed. A sudden pull, invisible and inescapable, yanked at his limbs, the sea's grip, a desperate last attempt to hold him. He gasped, his body locking in place as water swirled up his legs, climbing higher, wrapping around his chest. The cold bit into him, dragging him toward the abyss. Kale. Her voice, soft as foam, sharp as a siren's call. Through the chaos he saw her, Seraphine. She had followed him. Her silver eyes burned with something fierce, something endless, and before he could speak, she moved. With a flick of her tail, she surged forward, crossing the space between them in a heartbeat. Her hands found his, one on his wrist, the other against his jaw. He was drowning, but not from the sea, from her. From the way her touch turned the cold to warmth. From the way her breath mingled with his, their foreheads brushing, their souls caught between two tides. You cannot stay here, she whispered. Kale's smirk was weaker now, his strength fading. And yet, I always end up where I shouldn't. Seraphine exhaled, something breaking inside her. She had watched men die before. She had never cared. But this was different. This was him. Her fingers curled against his chest, feeling the slow, stubborn beat of his heart. It was strong, but it would not last. And so she did the unthinkable. She pressed her lips to his. The sea gasped. Kale did not, because everything else vanished. The cold, the weight, the endless pull of the tide, it all faded, swallowed by something deeper, something unknown. A binding, an offering, a secret given in the space between heartbeats. When she pulled away, the water no longer held him. Kale sucked in a breath, his body light, his limbs free. He barely had time to process what had happened before she whispered, "Go." His mind screamed against it, but her eyes said this was goodbye. And Kale Draven, a pirate who had never known what it meant to lose, was about to learn. With one final look, he let the tide carry him away. The sea had no mercy for men who defied it. Waves towered, The sky swallowed in a veil of storm clouds, and the winds howled their sorrow. The eclipse rocked violently as Cale Draven pulled himself over the railing, gasping for breath, his lungs burning with seawater and something deeper, a loss that had no name. His crew rushed to him, voices lost beneath the storm's fury, but Cale did not hear them. He did not feel the weight of their hands pulling him to safety, nor the ship beneath his feet. He felt only the press of lips now lost to the depths. Seraphine. His fingers curled against his chest, where her touch still lingered, where her final whisper still echoed. Go. But his heart did not want to leave. The sea had tried to claim him, to keep him as it kept its secrets, but she had given him back. Not just his life. Something more. His men shouted, pointing at the waves, where the water churned with unnatural force. A shape moved beneath the surface. A shadow, a presence, something watching. Cale's breath caught. For a fleeting moment, he saw her. Silver eyes beneath the waves. A glimmer of iridescent scales. The curve of a form that did not belong to this world, but to something older, something endless. She did not rise. She did not call for him. But she was there. His grip tightened on the railing. He could not speak, could not call her name, because the sea did not allow goodbyes. Only whispers, only echoes. Then, like a dream fading with the tide, she was gone. The ocean stilled. The storm passed. But Cale Draven would never be the same. He stood there long after the sky cleared, long after his men spoke of curses and miracles. The salt on his skin was not just from the sea, but from something deeper, a wound that would never heal. A pirate does not belong to the ocean. And yet he had left his heart beneath the waves.